Okay, so here is another setting that's so important and everyone misses, which is message compression. Basically, our producer usually sends data that is text-based. For example, we are sending, with this Twitter producer, we are sending some JSON data, and JSON is text. In this case, it's super important so you apply compression to the producer, because JSON is very text-heavy, it's very big in size, and we can actually compress it. So compression is basically something you enable at the producer level, and it does not require any configuration change at all in your brokers or in your consumers. Again, one setting to flip and everything works. So compression type can have multiple values. It can be none, which is the default, no compression, gzip, LZ4, and snappy. Basically, compression is more effective the bigger the batch of messages sent to Kafka. So the more data you send to Kafka and the more compression is going to be helpful, which is a bit unintuitive, but it actually makes a lot of sense. So there are some benchmarks you can read online on this blog from Cloudflare, which I'll just link to the course. And you can just read this blog and understand, what are the difference in performance, etc., etc. Bottom line is compression is super helpful and you need to have it. So here's how it works. We have a producer batch, and a producer batch is basically Kafka batching messages on its own. So it will have message 1, message 2, message 3, up to, say, message 100. It's because our producer sends a lot of messages, and it wants to send them all together if possible. Now, the producer batch will get compressed, because the producer, before sending the batch to Kafka, will start compressing the batch to make it much smaller. That only happens when you enable compression. Now, when we send this to Kafka, well, we have a big decrease in size, and automatically sending it to Kafka and replicating it across broker is so much quicker. So you have decreased latency and disk size and everything else. So that's why compression is so important, okay? Because you decrease stuff in size, and so Kafka brokers have to do less replication, you use less network bandwidth, and overall, it's just amazing. So the advantages to compress a batch are those. Number one is that you get a much smaller producer request size when it sends data to Kafka. And in my personal experience, I've seen the compression ratio can go up to 4x. So if you have a 10 megabytes message size, then after that, maybe it's going to be 2.5. So that just gives you some numbers. Now, it's also faster to transfer data over the network. Well, yes, indeed, you have much less data to transfer. Therefore, there is less latency, better throughput, etc., etc. Now, you also get better disk utilization in Kafka, because in Kafka, on the brokers, your messages will be stored in a compressed format. So basically, your disk has now more capacity for more messages. Now, there's obviously a few disadvantages. When you do compression, basically, producers must commit some CPU cycles to perform that compression, but that is usually very minor. Similarly, your consumers must commit some CPU cycles to decompress the data. And again, to me, that is absolutely very minor. Overall, I would encourage you to start considering testing Snappy or LZ4, because I personally found them to be having the optimal speed or compression ratio, okay, as a balance. gzip is going to have the highest compression ratio, but it's not very fast. So choose, test, it's super simple. You just change one setting and everything works. Now, my recommendations. I always say there's not one algorithm that works for everyone. So you just try them based on your pipeline that you have and see the one that works best for you. So just test them all. Always use compression in production, especially if you have a high throughput. I would say when I go to my clients and they're saying we're having huge problems, this producer is taking too much throughput, I look at their code, and if I see no compression, this is a big no-no for me. I tell them just enable some compression and see if that solves your problems. And usually it does definitely improve a lot the situation. Finally, and we'll see this in the next lecture, there's two other settings called linger millisecond and batch size, basically to control how big the batch is. And because we've seen that the bigger the batch, the better the compression, well, that's something that we want to definitely tweak. But overall, use compression. In the next lecture, we'll see linger millisecond and batch size, and then we'll go with hands-on to understand how to have a high throughput producer.